You probably didn't click on this video to learn anything serious. Maybe you just wanted something calm, something to quiet the noise of your brain to fill the background while you drift. But somehow, here you are, about to learn far more about the rise and fall of ancient Rome than anyone ever reasonably should. Now I'll warn you, this won't be one of those dramatic tales of glory and conquest. There will be no thunder of legions, no cinematic speeches about empire and destiny, just quiet roads, marble dust, and the slow, inevitable march of time. Because Rome didn't rise in a day, and it didn't fall in one either. It rose rather inconveniently over centuries, and then when it came time to collapse, it took its sweet time doing that too. So lie back. Close your eyes if you'd like. Let's wander together through the ruins of something that was once magnificent and is now mostly a metaphor. Tonight's story isn't meant to keep you awake, but it might, because once you start drifting through history, even the boring parts are oddly addictive. And if you find yourself coming back to these late-night lessons, you might as well subscribe. It doesn't cost you sleep. It just ensures that history keeps whispering you to bed. Now, let's begin. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've already survived longer than most early Roman kings. Now Rome was Rome before the emperors, the aqueducts, or even the sandals. It was just a collection of huts on 7 little hills by a bend in the Tiber River. The air was damp, the sheep were unimpressed, and nobody had any idea they were living in the future capital of the world. Legend, which is history's more imaginative cousin, tells us that the story of Rome began with 2 brothers, Romulus and Remus, raised supposedly by a she-wolf, which is one of those details that makes you wonder whether ancient people were just less concerned with fact-checking. You can almost picture it, though, the soft rustle of reeds by the river. 2 infants abandoned in a basket drifting toward destiny, and a wolf maternal inexplicably selective about her diet, deciding to raise them instead of eat them. Romulus and Remus grew up strong-willed and destined for drama. Like many siblings, their cooperation lasted only until real estate got involved. They argued over where to build their city. One thing led to another, and Romulus killed Remus. Thus, Rome began with fratricide, a city founded in brotherly love, minus one brother. It's not exactly a comforting start, but then again, Rome was never known for its sensitivity. You can imagine the scene. The rough, clay walls of early huts, smoke curling from cooking fires, the earthy smell of wool and damp soil. People trading goats, arguing over water, and telling themselves that this muddy hilltop was the center of the world. And perhaps, in some quietly confident way, it was. After Romulus, Rome supposedly had a series of kings, 7 of them if we believe the old list, which is a bit suspiciously tidy. Historians who hate tidy things suspect that at least half were invented to fill chronological gaps. But it makes for a good rhythm, doesn't it? 7 hills, 7 kings, 7 centuries before anyone thought to write things down properly. Romulus ruled first. He was the founder, which in early Rome mostly meant building walls and fighting neighbors. Then came Numa Pompilius, the peaceful one, the kind of ruler who preferred religion to warfare, a man who probably spent his reign sighing at everyone else's enthusiasm for stabbing. There was Tullus Hostilius, who brought back the stabbing with interest, Ancus Martius, who built bridges and ports, and then the so-called Etruscan kings, Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, and Tarquinius Superbus, whose names sound like an exhausting roll call at an ancient prep school. Under these kings, Rome transformed from a muddy village into a real city, with temples, walls, drainage systems, and a vague sense of destiny. You can almost hear it, the scrape of bronze tools, the chatter of traders, the splash of water in the Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer which remarkably still exists today. Because nothing outlasts Roman plumbing. Of course, the monarchy couldn't last forever. Romans didn't exactly excel at sharing power unless they were dividing it into smaller, more confusing units. The last king, Tarquinius Superbus, whose name literally means Tarquin the Proud, was overthrown around 509 BCE. The reason? A royal scandal, a rebellion, and probably a collective realization that Superbus is a terrible thing to call your ruler. Thus ended Rome's monarchy and began its long, complicated experiment with something resembling a republic. The Romans were proud of this new system. They had no kings, they said, only consuls, elected leaders who ruled together, which sounds wonderfully democratic until you realize how many loopholes there were. Only certain men could vote, fewer could run for office, and nearly everyone important was related to everyone else important. It was less government by the people and more government by an unusually determined family reunion. Still, the Republic was an improvement, a kind of organized chaos that somehow worked. You can almost picture the Senate in those early days, a semicircle of old men in togas, pretending to listen, each waiting for his turn to interrupt. Marble floors that echoed too much. Oil lamps flickering in the draught. The smell of ink, sweat, and faintly singed ambition. And outside, in the forum, the city buzzed, merchants shouting, children playing, soldiers drilling, gossip spreading faster than any official decree. Rome was growing, not gracefully, but relentlessly. Even at this early stage, you can sense something distinctly Roman in the air, that peculiar blend of practicality, pride, and pessimism. They weren't dreamers like the Greeks, nor mystics like the Egyptians. The Romans were builders, literal and metaphorical. They saw the world as something to be paved, walled, conquered, and then taxed. Their gods were like civil servants, busy, bureaucratic, and slightly judgmental. Every action required a ritual. Every ritual required a fee. If the divine accounting went well, Rome prospered. If not, someone got sacrificed and everyone moved on. There's something soothing in that simplicity, isn't there?
Do they think? Say the words.
Hope Jupiter's in a good mood. Rome didn't set out to conquer the world. It just had a talent for being inconveniently good at fighting. At first, it fought its neighbours, the Latin tribes, the Sabines, the Etruscans. Then it fought its former allies. Then it fought anyone within walking distance. And since Roman soldiers were known for walking absurd distances, this covered quite a lot of territory. By the 3rd century BCE, Rome had turned from a regional power into something much larger, a restless, growing force pressing out across the Italian peninsula. And what's more Roman than that? The refusal to stop expanding even when everyone's tired, hungry, and pretending to be fine. You might notice at this point that all of this took centuries. Rome's rise wasn't a story of overnight success. It was a slow, plodding accumulation of victories and mistakes, the historical equivalent of someone building an empire out of stubbornness and leftover bricks. If you're feeling a little drowsy now, that's appropriate. So were most Romans, after all. Centuries of building roads, debating laws, and marching through mud will do that to a civilization. Still in the midst of all this slow progress, something remarkable had begun. The idea of Rome itself.
Not just a city, but a concept.
A word that meant order, law, strength, and the occasional unnecessary war. You can rest here for a moment. Picture it, the early city, perched on its hills, the Tiber glinting in the distance. Torches flicker along the walls.
Someone is singing badly.
The air smells faintly of bread, olive oil, and ambition. That's where it all began, in a place that didn't know it was destined for greatness. And as you drift further into the story, remember, even the mightiest empires start with a single bad argument between brothers. You're still here, still awake or maybe half asleep, that fuzzy state where thoughts begin to drift and everything sounds a little slower.
That's fine. Rome would approve.
They were experts at doing things half asleep, debating, conquering, and sometimes even governing. When Rome became a republic around 509 BCE, it wasn't so much a revolution as it was an awkward reorganization. One day they had a king. The next day, they had 2 consuls, a senate, and the same amount of arguing. The Romans liked order, but only if they were the ones giving it. So they built a system that was complicated, self-important, and almost impossible to fully understand, which, as it turns out, is one of the best ways to keep people busy. You can imagine it. The Senate chamber, in its early days, still modest and dimly lit, echoing faintly with the sound of sandals and the low murmur of voices. Old men in togas debating law, duty, and which God needed appeasing this week. They talked about honor a lot, but mostly they just talked. Still, beneath all that dignified mumbling, the machinery of something new was turning. Rome had no kings now. Power was divided, at least in theory. Each year, citizens, male citizens with enough property, elected 2 consuls. These men shared power equally unless one decided not to. Below them were magistrates, praetors, quaestors, and an entire alphabet of officials whose duties often overlapped like badly drawn circles. It was confusing but functional, like a bureaucratic centipede. And then there was the Senate, not technically in charge, but always in control. A room full of former magistrates, all with opinions and none with retirement plans. They guided policy, debated wars, and found endless ways to remind everyone that they, not the people, were Rome's memory. Of course, not everyone agreed this was fair. The early republic was deeply unequal. A city divided between the patricians, the old aristocratic families who claimed descent from the first senators, and the plebeians, the ordinary citizens who made up most of the army, and none of the laws. The patricians owned the land, controlled the courts, and often acted like the gods themselves, took appointments from their calendar. The plebeians, meanwhile, worked, fought, and wondered why democracy felt so familiar to monarchy. It didn't take long for tension to rise. Around 494 BCE, the plebeians, tired of being ignored, decided on a very Roman form of protest. They walked out, literally. They marched out of the city and refused to come back until the patricians listened. No workers, no soldiers, no labor. The Senate panicked, not out of sympathy, but because without plebeians,
Rome couldn't function. The solution was a compromise. The creation of the tribune of the plebs.
an office meant to protect ordinary citizens from abuses of power. The tribunes had the sacred right to veto laws and decisions that threatened the people. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And slowly, over the next 2 centuries, plebeians would win more rights, including access to higher offices, intermarriage with patricians, and perhaps most importantly, a seat at the table. You can almost picture those early tribunes standing in the forum, surrounded by a restless crowd, their voices echoing against the stone walls of temples and basilicas, their words rising like smoke in the summer air, challenging the old men in the Senate. It must have been strange. The beginning of democracy, not with cheering, but with quiet, strategic persistence. The Republic, in its way, was a masterpiece of balance. No one person could hold power for too long. Every decision required debate, and every debate required patience. The Romans distrusted passion, and it was something for poets, not politicians. They valued control, discipline, and procedure. If there was a god of paperwork, they would have built him a temple. Still, despite all this balance, the Republic's greatest strength was also its flaw. It worked only when everyone agreed on the rules. And as history tends to remind us, rules are fragile things. While the politicians argued in marble halls, the soldiers were busy outside the walls, expanding Rome's reach through Italy. It started small, local conflicts, border skirmishes, raids that turned into annexations. The Roman army was made up of citizen soldiers, men who fought not for glory, but for obligation. Service was part of life. If you owned land, you were expected to defend it. And defend it they did, with remarkable efficiency. Their secret wasn't genius, but discipline. The Roman legion was a slow, methodical machine. Every man had a place. Every command had a purpose. They built roads as they marched, camps as they slept, and enemies as they conquered. Other armies might win battles. Rome won routines. By the 4th century BCE, the city had grown too large to ignore. It had allies, enemies, and a new kind of confidence. But it also had a problem: the Gauls. In 390 BCE, a group of Celtic warriors from the north swept down into Italy and did what few thought possible. They sacked Rome. The Senate fled. The city burned, and legend says the sacred geese of Juno honked in warning during a nighttime attack, saving the last defenders on the Capitoline Hill. It was humiliating, but it changed Rome forever. The Romans rebuilt stronger, harder, and with a lesson burned into their collective memory: never again. After that, everything they built was meant to last. Walls thicker, roads straighter, laws more permanent. You can feel the shift in their spirit, a kind of paranoia mixed with pride. They began to think of themselves not just as a city, but as destiny-wearing sandals. Over the next century, Rome would dominate Italy, forging alliances, demanding loyalty, and offering citizenship, or something close enough to keep people quiet. Their control wasn't always kind, but it was effective. Where Rome went, roads followed, and where roads went, Rome stayed. If you close your eyes, you can almost see it. The dusty roads stretching out from the city like veins, carrying soldiers, traders, and gossip. Villages turning into towns, towns into colonies, Latin words spreading across the hills. The hum of order replacing the wild rhythm of old Italy. There's a quiet inevitability to it all. The Republic didn't just expand, it absorbed. Cultures, gods, and languages were folded into its identity like layers of stone in a wall. And beneath that steady expansion lay the simple Roman belief that anything could be improved by a little structure and a lot of perseverance. By the 3rd century BCE, Rome ruled most of Italy. Its armies had learned to fight in every terrain, mountains, plains, and coasts. Its senators had learned to argue about every possible topic, taxes, treaties, and the proper number of augurs required before lunch. And just as things seemed stable, a new rival appeared across the sea: Carthage. The two cities couldn't have been more different.
Rome, practical and austere.
Carthage, wealthy and mercantile, one ruled by farmers and generals, the other by traders and admirals. They shared the Mediterranean the way two cats share a narrow windowsill, uncomfortably. It was only a matter of time before someone pushed. But that, perhaps, is a story for the next chapter. For now, you can rest here at the edge of the Republic's early triumph. The city hums with confidence. The senators are content. The soldiers are home, polishing armor and complaining about rations. Somewhere in the distance, a smith hammers bronze. A baker sets out bread. The Tiber drifts quietly by. Rome is still young, still hopeful, still pretending it understands how long forever really is. And you're still awake, barely, but that's fine. The story is only just beginning to get complicated. You can feel the world getting a little bigger now.
Rome has grown beyond its hills, its markets, its tidy sense of being the center of everything.
The air is thicker with ambition. The maps are wider, and across the blue expanse of the Mediterranean, someone else is watching. Carthage. You can almost see it if you imagine hard enough, bright and glittering on the coast of North Africa. Ships rocking gently in the harbour, sails furled, merchants arguing over ivory, glass and purple dye. The smell of salt, resin and money. Carthage was old, older than Rome, a city of trade and sea and mathematics. Where Rome built with stone, Carthage built with coin. Where Rome conquered by sword, Carthage conquered by contract. Two cities, two empires in the making, separated by water and by temperament. It was inevitable, really. Empires are like neighbours with expanding fences. They can only grow in opposite directions for so long before one starts eyeing the other's yard. The trouble began over a small island, Sicily.
Not a bad place, as disputes go.
Fertile, strategic, surrounded by water and grapes. Both sides wanted it. Neither wanted to share. And so began the First Punic War in 264 BCE. Punic, by the way, comes from Poeni, the Latin word for Phoenician, since Carthage was originally a Phoenician colony. The Romans, who loved labelling things, decided that every war with Carthage would henceforth be a Punic one. It sounds dignified, but it was mostly a 23-year argument over who could sail better. Now the funny thing is, Rome didn't have a navy. Not really. They were a land people, fond of sandals and soil, not sails. But Carthage was a maritime empire, its ships swift and elegant. So Rome, naturally, decided to improvise. They found a wrecked Carthaginian ship, copied it piece by piece, and built an entire fleet from scratch. A very Roman solution to a very nautical problem. The result wasn't graceful. The new Roman ships were heavier and clumsier, but they came with an innovation, the corvus, or crow, a boarding bridge with a metal spike. The idea was simple. If you can't outsail them, turn the sea into land. Every naval battle became a floating infantry fight. You can imagine the scene, the crash of waves, the clang of bronze, the shouts of men trying not to drown or lose sandals overboard, the smell of tar and sweat and distant burning wood. It was loud, chaotic, and somehow effective. After 2 decades of struggle, Carthage surrendered. Rome took control of Sicily, its first province outside Italy. It doesn't sound like much now, just an island on a map, but it marked the beginning of something enormous. Rome was no longer just a republic. It was an empire in training. Of course, peace never lasts long in stories like this. There was a pause, a generation, maybe 2, enough time for both cities to rebuild, rearm, and quietly resent each other. Then, in 218 BCE, it all began again, the Second Punic War. And this time, it wasn't about ships. It was about elephants. You've probably heard of him, Hannibal Barca. The Carthaginian general with a reputation so sharp it could cut through centuries. Tall, intelligent, ruthless, in that efficient way commanders tend to be. He swore an oath of hatred against Rome as a boy, and apparently he meant it. When Carthage decided to expand into Spain, Rome naturally objected. There were treaties involved, lines on maps that both sides interpreted creatively. One small town, Saguntum, became the spark. Rome claimed it was under their protection. Hannibal claimed otherwise. Soon, Saguntum fell, and the Second Great War began. You can picture Hannibal's army marching north, soldiers from Spain and North Africa, cavalry from Numidia, and of course, the elephants. They weren't the enormous Indian elephants you might imagine, but smaller African forest elephants in agile, temperamental and probably very confused by the Alps. Yes, the Alps, that's the part everyone remembers. Hannibal's bold, almost absurd decision to cross the mountains into Italy. The icy winds, the narrow passes, the snow blinding and endless. Men freezing, animals slipping, entire columns vanishing into the mist. It's one of those moments in history where determination crosses into madness. And somehow, it worked. When Hannibal emerged into Italy, what was left of his army was battered but dangerous. The Romans, meanwhile, were confident.
Too confident.
They thought they could crush him easily. They were wrong. At the river Trebia, they charged into icy waters and were ambushed. At Lake Trasimene, they were trapped in the fog and slaughtered. And then came Cannae, 216 BCE, one of the most devastating defeats in Roman history. You can imagine the dry, dusty plain of southern Italy that morning, the sun climbing lazily over the horizon. The Roman army, perhaps 80,000 strong, marching in tight formation, armor glinting, banners waving. Hannibal's forces were smaller but cunningly arranged, a crescent of infantry that lured the Romans inward while cavalry closed from behind. By midday, it was over. The Roman army had been surrounded and destroyed.
Tens of thousands lay dead.
It was said the fields were so thick with bodies that the wind itself moved slower. Rome's allies trembled. The Senate went silent. And yet somehow the Republic did not break. That's the part people often forget. The stubbornness of Rome. They didn't surrender. They didn't negotiate. They just kept going. They raised new armies, found new commanders, and waited, because Rome, for all its flaws, had patience. Years passed. Hannibal roamed Italy, undefeated but unable to strike the final blow. Meanwhile, a young Roman general named Scipio rose to prominence, calm, strategic, almost unnervingly collected. He realized that to defeat Hannibal, Rome needed to fight the war backward, not in Italy, but in Carthage's own territory. So Scipio crossed into North Africa, drawing Hannibal home. In 202 BCE, they faced each other near Zama. The elephants charged first, massive shapes thundering across the dust, but Scipio's lines held. When the battle ended, Hannibal was defeated. The war, at last, was over. Carthage survived, but barely. They paid enormous reparations, surrendered their fleet, and agreed never to wage war without Rome's permission. A humiliating peace signed with weary ink. Hannibal himself lived on for years, hunted across the Mediterranean until he chose exile and finally death, a quiet, bitter end for one of history's greatest tacticians. Rome, of course, celebrated. They had conquered the most powerful rival in the Western world. Their navy ruled the sea. Their legions ruled the land. But victory came with appetite. Once you conquer one empire, it's hard to stop. The next century brought expansions into Spain, Greece, and beyond. Carthage, humbled and resentful, rebuilt quietly, focusing on trade and prosperity. It might have stayed that way, peaceful, almost polite, if not for Roman paranoia. Cato the Elder, a senator famous for his seriousness, ended every speech with the same words: Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed, even if he was discussing taxes, or grain supply, or the weather. He'd finish with that line, just to remind everyone that sleeping enemies were still enemies. And so, in 149 BCE, Rome began the Third Punic War. It wasn't really a war, more of an extermination. Carthage resisted bravely but hopelessly. After 3 years, the city fell.
Roman soldiers moved street by street, torching, looting, destroying.
The city burned for days. According to legend, the ground was sown with salt so that nothing would grow there again. It's hard to say if that part is true. History loves poetic flourishes, but the result was real enough. Carthage was gone.
Rome stood alone.
The Mediterranean, once a patchwork of rivals, was now a Roman lake. You can almost hear the silence after the fire, the waves lapping against blackened stones, the whisper of wind through empty streets, the ashes cooling in the morning light. And somewhere far away in Rome itself, senators were already planning the next campaign. That's the thing about empire. It never feels finished. There's always another shore to reach, another people to civilize, another map to redraw. Rome told itself it was bringing order to the world, and maybe, in its way, it was. But order has a price. It always does. For now, though, the Republic basked in triumph. Its fleets patrolled the sea. Its legions marched on polished roads. Its citizens filled the forum with chatter about glory and taxes. And through it all, the quiet hum of inevitability grew a little louder, because every rise carries the echo of a fall. You can rest here for a moment, as Rome enjoys the calm between storms. The fires of Carthage have faded to embers. The senators are smug, the soldiers are restless. The world for now belongs to them, but not forever.
Never forever.
You can feel it, can't you? That faint vibration beneath the marble, the hum of something too large for its own foundations.
Rome has conquered the known world, or at least enough of it to sound impressive.
Carthage is gone, Greece has been lectured into submission, and the senators are running out of enemies to blame for their boredom. But when an empire stops expanding outward, it starts expanding inward. And that's when the cracks begin to show. It starts quietly, as it often does. A whisper in the forum, a rumor about land, a few coins exchanged under a table. The Republic, once so proud of its balance and virtue, is starting to sag under its own success. The wars have brought home unimaginable wealth. Gold, slaves, marble, spices, scrolls, philosophers. The senators love the philosophers. They don't read them, but they do look excellent sitting beside imported scrolls. Meanwhile, the average Roman farmer, the one who once formed the backbone of the army, comes home to find his land bought up by someone richer. Larger estates swallowing small farms like a slow tide. You can picture it. Dusty hills outside the city, once green with family plots, now covered in sprawling estates, latifundia, worked by thousands of slaves captured in foreign wars. The free citizens, the men who fought for Rome, find themselves unemployed, outbid, and increasingly irrelevant. They drift into the city, looking for work that doesn't exist, for bread that's getting more expensive. In the forum, senators debate the state of the people. They do it with the tone of men discussing the weather. Serious, but never too serious. After all, it's hard to focus on poverty when your dinner party starts with oysters from Africa and ends with wine older than your servant. Still, a few voices begin to rise above the murmur. Two brothers, young, idealistic, and dangerously earnest. The Gracchi. Tiberius Gracchus was the first. Born into privilege, yes, but with a sense of duty that made his colleagues uncomfortable. He looked at the vast estates and the empty fields, the citizens crowding the streets, and he decided something had gone wrong. Land, he thought, should belong to those who worked it, not just to those who could afford an army of gardeners. As tribune, in 133 BCE, he proposed a radical law to limit the amount of public land one man could own and redistribute the rest to the poor. It was simple, moral, and politically suicidal. You can imagine the reaction. The Senate was horrified, not because they disagreed in principle, but because they all owned rather a lot of public land. They accused Tiberius of overreach,
of ambition, of threatening the sacred balance of the Republic.
And perhaps, in their own way, they were right. The Republic thrived on procedure, not passion. And Tiberius, well, he had passion in abundance. The debates grew heated.
Rumors spread.
At one point, when his term was ending, Tiberius tried to run for re-election. Technically legal, but unprecedented. That was enough to push his enemies over the edge. During a public meeting, violence erupted. Tiberius and hundreds of his supporters were beaten to death with clubs, their bodies thrown into the Tiber. That was how reform died. Not with debate, but with bludgeons. 10 years later, his brother Gaius tried again. He was sharper, more strategic, less trusting. He proposed new laws, grain subsidies for the poor, citizenship for Italian allies, infrastructure projects to employ the jobless. The people adored him. The Senate did not. For a while it worked.
Rome seemed on the edge of something hopeful.
But hope in Rome had an expiration date. Gaius, like his brother, was declared a threat to the state. Surrounded by armed opponents, he chose death rather than capture. His followers were hunted, their homes burned, their names erased. And yet the damage was done, not by the Gracchi, but by those who killed them. Something sacred had been broken.
Violence had entered politics, and it would never leave again. You can almost hear it, the uneasy quiet that follows.
The Senate pretending everything is normal. The people pretending they believe it. The sound of sandals in the forum echoing off stone as the Republic exhales and tells itself that stability has been restored. It hadn't. The decades that followed were a slow erosion of trust. The wars kept coming, against Jugurtha in North Africa, against Germanic tribes in the north, against Mithridates in the east. Each victory brought wealth, glory, and more power to the generals who led them. That's how Gaius Marius entered the story. A common man by Roman standards, no famous ancestors, no noble lineage, just a soldier who happened to be very good at what he did. He reformed the army, opening its ranks to the poor. Before Marius, soldiers fought for the Republic. After Marius, they fought for whoever promised them land and loot. It was a clever reform, and also a catastrophic one. Rome now had professional soldiers, men loyal not to the Senate, but to their general. Marius became a hero, then a symbol, then a problem. His rival, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, was another ambitious general, colder and far more ruthless. The two men despised each other, and their rivalry tore the Republic in two. You can imagine it. Soldiers marching through Italy, not to defend the state, but to claim it. Streets once filled with merchants and orators, now echoing with the clang of armor and the crackle of fires. Rome itself, the city that had conquered the world, becomes a battlefield. Sulla marched on Rome twice, the first general in history to do so. He seized power, exiled enemies, and filled the forum with proscription lists, names of people declared outlaws, their property confiscated, their lives forfeit. If your name appeared, your friends avoided you. Your slaves betrayed you. Your neighbors looted your home before the soldiers arrived. It was, in short, efficient tyranny. Sulla called himself dictator, but with a twist. Not just for a few months, as tradition allowed, but indefinitely. He rewrote the laws, strengthened the Senate, and told everyone it was to restore the Republic. Restoration, in Roman politics, always seemed to involve a lot of funerals. And yet, when he'd done enough purging, Sulla did something astonishing. He retired. He simply stepped down, claiming he had fixed everything. He retired to his villa and, as the story goes, spent his last years drinking too much and reminiscing about the good old days when murder still felt purposeful. But what he left behind wasn't peace. It was a precedent that armies could rule and that politics could bleed. You can almost see the city now, worn but functioning, like a candle burning on both ends. Senators debating morality while bribing each other for votes. Generals polishing their reputations as carefully as their armor. The people restless, cynical, waiting for someone new to fix what everyone else had broken. And waiting,
as always, was dangerous. Because when a state grows tired of politicians,
it begins to dream of strong men, of heroes, of saviors. The Republic was becoming a place of ghosts, haunted by the ideals it once believed in. Virtus, pietas, gravitas, the old Roman virtues, now recited more than practiced. The temples were still standing, the rituals still performed, but belief had become ceremony. In the streets, bread and circuses replaced philosophy. The crowds grew larger, louder, hungrier. Grain dolls and gladiator games kept them quiet, a kind of social anesthesia. As long as the arena was loud enough, the Senate could keep pretending things were fine. You can imagine the forum in those days. Dazzling, noisy, a mixture of grandeur and decay. Columns shining in the sun, graffiti scrawled on marble, beggars sleeping beneath the arches of temples. A city at its peak, and somehow already exhausted. The senators, wrapped in white togas with purple borders, drift from one debate to another, arguing about taxes, borders, and whether the state should pay for more games. Behind them, the streets pulse with humanity. Freedmen, slaves, merchants, soldiers, foreigners, all part of the great machine that now runs mostly on habit. It's a strange kind of stability, the stability of momentum. Rome doesn't know where it's going, but it can't stop moving. Meanwhile, far from the marble and noise, a new generation of ambitious men is watching.
Men who grew up in the shadow of Marius and Sulla. Men who learned that power is something you take,
not something you're given. Among them are names that will echo forever. Pompey, Crassus, and a young man with sharp eyes and inconvenient charm named Gaius Julius Caesar. But for now, they are still in the background, waiting for their cue. The curtain hasn't lifted yet on their part of the story. What matters now is that the Republic, though still standing, has already fallen in spirit. The Senate no longer represents the people. The people no longer trust the Senate. The laws are still written, but they bend too easily. The legions still march, but not always in the same direction. And through it all, Rome keeps telling itself that nothing has changed.
That the Republic will endure because it always has.
It's a comforting lie, the kind that keeps civilizations warm for a little while longer. You can almost feel the weight of it. The centuries of pride, the layers of tradition, the rituals, the statues, the endless speeches about liberty, all of it pressing down on a system that was never designed to hold an empire. Because that's the quiet tragedy of Rome. It built a world too big for its own rules. The senators are still speaking. The forum still hums. The temples still stand. But beneath it all, the foundation is cracking, slowly, softly, like marble under too much weight. And if you listen closely, you can hear it, the faint sound of history exhaling before everything changes. The sound of the river fades behind you. The die is indeed cast, and the board is the world. As Caesar's legions march south toward Rome, word spreads faster than the soldiers can walk.
The city panics.
Senators who once thundered about honor now quietly pack their valuables and flee. Pompey, the great general, the man who once made kings tremble, chooses retreat. He abandons Rome without a fight, taking his loyal forces east to Greece. And so, the city that once conquered the world now trembles before its own sun. When Caesar enters, it is not with triumph, but with restraint. He walks through silent streets, No cheering crowds this time, no parade. Just the whisper of sandals on stone and the knowledge that the Republic, as everyone knew it, has come to an end. He doesn't linger. He secures the treasury, ensures order, and moves on. The real war is elsewhere. Pompey gathers his forces in the east. Senators, nobles, exiled generals, all convinced that they are defending the true Rome. Caesar, meanwhile, chases them with the calm persistence of a man who's already seen the end of the play. The campaigns that follow are swift, efficient, and strangely inevitable. At Pharsalus in 48 BCE, the two great men of Rome finally meet in battle. Pompey's army outnumbers Caesar's 2-1, yet Caesar fights with the quiet confidence of someone who knows luck has chosen a side. The dust rises, the trumpets sound, and for a few brutal hours, history holds its breath. When the dust settles, Pompey's army is shattered, his men surrendering or switching sides. Pompey himself flees to Egypt, seeking refuge from a young king and his ambitious sister, Cleopatra. But the Egyptians, ever practical, decide that a living Pompey is more trouble than a dead one. When Caesar arrives days later, they present him with a gift, Pompey's severed head, still fresh from the sea. It's the sort of gesture that only politics could call hospitality. Caesar doesn't smile. According to the historians, he weeps.
Perhaps genuinely, perhaps from the weight of what it means.
He orders Pompey's remains buried with honor. The Republic, in that act, is quietly laid to rest as well. And then, because he is Caesar, he stays in Egypt. The Nile glitters under the sun. Alexandria hums with life. Scholars, traders, temples, libraries, and somewhere among the perfumed halls and polished marble waits, Cleopatra. History, as it tends to, turns this into romance. Perhaps it was. Perhaps it was also strategy. Cleopatra was clever, fluent in languages, steeped in politics, and determined to keep her throne. Caesar, meanwhile, found in her both charm and utility. Together they formed a union that Rome would later gossip about for decades. For a few months, Caesar lingered there, drifting down the Nile with Cleopatra, watching the water flash gold beneath the oars. It was a pause, brief, decadent, and doomed. But Rome does not sleep long without supervision. Caesar returned west to finish what he started. First in Asia Minor, where he defeated King Pharnaces in a matter of days, sending back the famously terse message, Veni, Vidi, Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. He returned to Rome as its undisputed ruler. No elections, no rivals, no equal. The Senate, stripped of courage, granted him titles, honors, and powers. Dictator for 10 years, then dictator for life. You can almost feel the irony. The Republic, once so proud of its checks and balances, now kneeling before a single man and calling it restoration. Caesar, for his part, seemed to believe it. He spoke often of mercy, of reform, of healing the wounds of civil war. He passed laws to limit corruption, to expand citizenship, to relieve debt. He filled the Senate with loyal men, many of them from provinces that had never before had a voice in government. It was radical, generous, and deeply unsettling to the old aristocrats. He reformed the calendar too, a small, tidy symbol of order in a world that had forgotten it. The Julian calendar, the very one whose echo still measures your days. But for all his brilliance, Caesar made one mistake that history never forgives. He forgot that power is never grateful. The senators who had survived his rise watched him with growing resentment. They told themselves they were saving Rome from tyranny, but perhaps they simply couldn't bear to see what they'd become, servants in a republic of one. And Caesar, basking in adoration, began to believe his own myth. He dressed in royal colors, sat on a golden chair, and allowed statues of himself among those of the gods. Rumors spread that he wanted to be king, a word that Romans hated almost as much as they loved gossip. On the Ides of March, 44 BCE, the Senate met in the theatre of Pompey. An elegant irony, considering whose name adorned the place. Caesar entered unarmed, confident, and perhaps tired. He had been warned of danger, of omens, of dreams, but he brushed them aside. You can imagine the moment. Sunlight spilling through the high arches, the murmur of senators greeting him, the rustle of togas, then the circle closing, the sudden movement, the shot, steel flashes, the first cut lands. It isn't quick. It isn't noble. Dozens of men, some once his friends, strike him again and again. Blood on marble, a god brought down by paperwork. According to legend, his last words were addressed to one of them. Et tu, Brute? Are you too, Brutus? But perhaps he said nothing at all. Perhaps he simply fell in silence, the way great empires eventually do. When the senators emerged, they expected applause. They had killed a tyrant, restored liberty, saved the republic. But outside, the crowd was not cheering. The people wept. They adored Caesar, not because he was perfect, but because he had given them spectacle, hope, and a sense that someone was finally in charge. Rome had outgrown the idea of being ruled by committees. In the days that followed, the assassins realized the horror of their success. They had removed the man, but not the machine he built. Power, like nature, despises a vacuum. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general, seized control of his papers, his funds, his funeral. The funeral itself was chaos. Antony held up Caesar's blood-stained cloak before the crowd, reciting his victories, his generosity, his mercy. The people, swayed by grief and fury, turned on the conspirators. They fled for their lives. And in the ashes of that moment, new stars began to rise. Antony, and another man far quieter, but far more dangerous, Gaius Octavius,
Caesar's adopted heir, but that, as you can feel,
belongs to another night. For now, imagine the city in mourning. The torches flicker along the Tiber, the streets smell of wax and smoke. Somewhere, a single flame trembles in the wind as Caesar's body burns. The senators hide in shadows, the soldiers wait, the people whisper. And Rome, that eternal, restless, sleepless city, turns slowly towards something new. Not a republic,
not yet an empire.
Just the long, drowsy silence between what was and what must come. You breathe it in, the scent of smoke, of marble dust, of change. The story isn't over, but something has ended all the same. The age of men debating in togas has passed. The age of men ruling with armies is about to begin. Sleep for now. The world is still turning, and Rome, as always, is simply changing its form. You can almost hear it, the uneasy hush that followed Caesar's death. The crowd in the Senate house had long since scattered, their sandals echoing off marble as whispers turned into rumors, and rumors turned into fear. Rome, that city of noise and triumph, suddenly found itself holding its breath, and you sitting there centuries later can almost feel it. The strange quiet after the knife has already fallen. The Republic, technically, was restored, but the illusion fooled no one. The men who'd stabbed Caesar to save freedom were about to learn what most Romans already suspected. The age of old ideals was gone. What came next would be built on charisma, soldiers, and public opinion of a dangerous combination, even for a sleepy civilization. You might imagine that night. Torches flickering in the forum, the smell of oil and smoke mixing with the faint sweetness of spilled wine.
Rome was not mourning its leader.
Rome was calculating. Mark Antony, of course, wasted no time stepping into the spotlight. He was dramatic like that, all confidence and bravado with a touch of theatrical outrage. Standing at Caesar's funeral, he read the will aloud, letting every line hang like bait. It promised money to the people, land to veterans, love letters to Rome itself. Antony knew exactly what he was doing. You can picture it. The crowd begins to stir. Some are confused,
Others begin to cry.
then anger builds, slow, rising, dangerous. The same crowd that had watched senators stab Caesar now turns on those same senators with fury.
Antony doesn't stop them.
He lets the chaos breathe. He lets Rome burn just a little. And you, half dreaming through history, might almost admire him, the way he turns mourning into power. But this is where things start to get complicated, because somewhere far from the forum, another player is quietly watching. His name is Gaius Octavius, though soon the world will know him as Augustus. He's young, 19, pale, almost delicate, Caesar's great-nephew. But most importantly, Caesar's adopted son and heir. It's funny how Rome always found its rulers in paperwork rather than prophecy. When Octavian hears of Caesar's death, he doesn't panic. He doesn't rage. He calculates. He takes the name Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus because in Rome, names were weapons. And by doing so, he reminds everyone, gently, legally, that Caesar's power didn't die with him. It merely changed address. You can imagine him arriving in Rome, calm and careful, while Antony blusters about in public like a tragic hero.
Octavian moves like a shadow through the Senate corridors.
He shakes hands. He listens more than he speaks. He promises loyalty to Caesar's veterans. He promises safety to the Senate. He promises everything to everyone, which is, historically, a very efficient way to start an empire. Antony, of course, underestimates him. Most people did. Octavian looks soft. He's polite. He doesn't drink much. He prefers documents to duels. Antony, by contrast, is all fire and muscle and ego. But Rome is tired. It's had a century of men like Antony. It's ready for someone who speaks softly but carries the entire Senate in his pocket. The two form a temporary alliance, because politics, much like sleep, is all about pretending to cooperate. They join forces with Lepidus,
Another general with an army and a mild personality, useful qualities in a puppet.
Together they form what history calls the Second Triumvirate. It sounds official, but really it's a legalized dictatorship, a three-headed monster with matching togas. Their first act, a little thing called prescription, the ancient Roman tradition of writing down everyone they didn't like, posting the list in public, and letting bounty hunters do the rest. It's disturbingly organized, almost bureaucratic. Antony adds Cicero to the list because Cicero made the mistake of mocking him in public. Cicero, the great orator, the voice of the old republic, tries to flee, but words are slower than soldiers. He's caught, executed, his hands and tongue displayed in the forum. A grim message. Eloquence dies last. You can almost hear the eerie stillness of that moment, the quiet realization that Rome is now owned by its generals. Freedom exists only on parchment, and parchment burns easily. Meanwhile, Octavian keeps smiling, keeps waiting. He lets Antony enjoy the headlines while he quietly builds loyalty. Soldiers love him because he pays them on time. Senators tolerate him because he flatters their dignity. The people, well, they like that he doesn't shout, but cracks appear quickly. The triumvirate was never built to last. It was built to buy time. Lepidus fades into irrelevance, pushed to the side like an old chair that everyone politely forgets about. That leaves two, Antony and Octavian, and Rome has never been big enough for two ambitious men. Antony drifts eastward. The East has always called to Romans who like wealth, silk, and the illusion of luxury. There, in the golden halls of Alexandria, he meets Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, and the two begin one of history's most over-analyzed romances. You might think of Cleopatra reclining on her barge, surrounded by incense and exotic music, as Kid and Antony, caught between empire and enchantment. To the Roman mind, this looked suspiciously like betrayal. To Octavian, it looked like opportunity. Back in Rome, Octavian begins his quiet campaign, not with armies, but with words. He whispers about Antony's decadence. He prints leaflets, primitive propaganda really, claiming that Antony has gone native, bewitched by an Egyptian queen, plotting to move the capital to Alexandria. You can almost hear the Senate gasp at that. Rome's pride wounded not by war, but by gossip. By the time Antony and Cleopatra realize what's happening, it's too late. Octavian controls the Senate. He controls the legions. He controls the story. And in history, whoever tells the story usually wins. There's something almost gentle about Octavian's cruelty. He doesn't roar, he rearranges. He lets Antony self-destruct, one slow rumor at a time. The alliance dissolves, predictably, into civil war again. Rome seems to have a hard time falling asleep without one. And somewhere in the background,
You, the listener, the time traveller, might start to notice the rhythm of it all.
the way history repeats itself, not in thunder but in quiet footsteps, each man claiming to restore peace by seizing control. Each generation believing it's the last one that will ever need to fight. The triumvirate is dead. The Republic,
Again is dying, and out of the exhaustion,
out of the chaos, a single man begins to emerge, young, patient, and disturbingly calm. Octavian has learned Rome's deepest secret, that people don't actually want freedom. They want rest. And Rome, after so many years of civil war, is ready to sleep under one man's watchful eye. You can almost hear the faint sound of waves in the distance. The Mediterranean, breathing softly, waiting for its new master. The ships are being prepared. The soldiers are sharpening swords, and you, drifting gently between awareness and drowsiness, know what's coming next. The final war. The one that will end a century of chaos and begin something far more permanent. The war for peace. The war that will crown a boy as emperor. The sea is quiet that morning. You can almost hear the wind brushing across the sails, the faint rhythm of oars dipping into water. It is 31 BCE, and the world has come down to two names, Antony and Octavian. Two men, both claiming to restore order, both insisting they fight for Rome. It's almost poetic, and entirely predictable. The battle takes place off the coast of Greece, near a small city called Actium. You might imagine standing on the cliffs above the bay, watching from a distance as the two fleets spread out like dark wings across the glittering water. The air smells of salt and oil. Gulls drift lazily overhead, unaware that history is about to turn. On one side, Antony and Cleopatra, their ships heavy, ornate, full of Eastern promise. On the other,
Octavian's admiral,
Agrippa with leaner ships, tighter discipline, and a patience that unnerves his enemies. The clash begins slowly.
As all great disasters do, sails crack.
Ramming beaks cut through waves, men shout orders that vanish into the wind. And then, in the middle of chaos, Cleopatra's ships begin to retreat. Maybe it was fear.
Maybe it was strategy.
Maybe it was the moment she realized Antony's war was already lost. Whatever the reason, Antony follows her, leaving most of his fleet behind. You can almost hear the sigh that runs through the ranks of his soldiers as they watch their commander sail away. The sea swallows the sound of defeat, and Rome, once again, belongs to the patient man. Back in the city,
Octavian moves carefully.
he doesn't rush to call himself emperor. That would sound arrogant, and arrogance still makes Romans twitch. Instead, he talks about peace. He talks about stability. He talks about bringing back the old values, while quietly rewriting what those values mean. When Antony and Cleopatra die, the stories vary. Of course, Rome treats it like the end of a long and embarrassing play. Antony, defeated, falls on his sword. Cleopatra, regal to the last, chooses her own exit. Perhaps by asp, perhaps by poison. The details no longer matter. The symbolism does. The East is humbled. Rome has its myth. Octavian has his stage. He returns to the city not as conqueror, but as healer. He lets the Senate honor him
as though they are still in control. They give him new titles, princeps.
the first citizen, a title that sounds modest but hides absolute authority. Later they'll call him Augustus, the revered one. It's a clever name, not king, not dictator, just holy enough to make obedience feel like devotion. You might picture him walking through the forum, calm and composed, the marble glowing faintly in the morning sun. People bow slightly as he passes.
No one shouts.
No one dares. It's not fear yet, it's relief. Rome, after generations of blood and betrayal, can finally close its eyes. Augustus rebuilds the city, brick by brick. He repairs temples, restores rituals, rewards loyalty, and smiles when people call him the savior of the Republic. He knows, and they know, that the Republic no longer exists, but no one says it aloud. It's easier that way. Everyone gets to pretend that nothing changed, that they are still free citizens, not subjects, that Rome has merely stabilized. There's something hypnotic about that kind of lie, the one everyone agrees to believe. It's how empires are born, not in a blaze, but in a sigh. He reorganizes the provinces, trims the Senate, creates a professional civil service. He establishes the Praetorian Guard, his personal bodyguards, though he frames them as defenders of peace. He builds roads, aqueducts, and monuments to himself so gracefully that people call them monuments to Rome. He understands something essential about humans. If you give them clean water, bread, and a little spectacle, they'll forgive almost anything. And so he gives them games, grand festivals, chariot races, gladiatorial shows that make the crowd roar until their throats are dry. The more distracted they are, the less they ask questions. You can almost see the shimmer of heat above the arena, the blur of movement as the crowd leans forward in unison. They cheer not for blood, really, but for normalcy, the comforting rhythm of empire. At night, when the city grows quiet and torches flicker along the Tiber, you might imagine Augustus sitting in his villa reviewing reports, adjusting decrees, thinking about the balance of power. He rules like a man afraid of waking something, a ghost, perhaps called the Republic, so he keeps everything calm, deliberate, ritualized. Even his private life becomes a lesson in public virtue. He exiles his own daughter for immorality, partly as moral theatre, partly because the appearance of control is worth any personal cost. The message is clear. The emperor is father to Rome, stern but fair, human yet untouchable. You, listening now, might feel the pace of the story.
Slow, it's meant to, because this is the moment history exhales. The wars are over, the streets are safe.
Empire stretches farther than anyone ever dreamed. The Roman people, weary of politics, sink into the luxury of stability. And Augustus, soft-spoken and endlessly patient,
lets them rest beneath the illusion of freedom. It's strange, isn't it?
How power, once loud and violent, becomes quiet and administrative. How a single man can hold the world together by pretending not to rule it. You can almost picture him in his old age, hair silvered, expression mild, walking through the gardens of his palace. The air smells of rosemary and dust. He tells friends he found Rome brick and left it marble. It's the kind of line you can only say when you know history will quote you forever. As the sun sets, Rome glows like embered gold. Temples shimmer, statues cast long, dignified shadows, and somewhere, beyond the city walls, farmers and soldiers alike whisper his name with a kind of quiet gratitude. The Republic has become an empire, but it doesn't matter anymore. People have bread, baths, and a story to believe in. That's all any civilization ever really wants before it drifts to sleep. You might close your eyes here and imagine the city at night. Lamps flickering.
Voices fading, the soft hum of empire. Everything is calm, everything is orderly, everything is
Roman. And so the boy who avenged Caesar becomes the man who outlives the Republic. He dies peacefully, surrounded by family, whispering that he has played his part well. And perhaps, as history folds around him, you realize he did. The city breathes differently now. No longer the frantic pulse of civil wars, no longer the fear that a senator's dagger could end a dynasty. Rome has learned to sleep, at least on the surface. The streets are cleaner, or at least cleaner than they were when generals marched over them. Merchants hawk olives and wine without soldiers tramping over their stalls. The air smells of bread and dust, of incense and warm stone. You can hear the faint clatter of chariots over cobblestones, a rhythm that somehow reassures. Life continues, predictably, hypnotically, under the careful watch of Augustus. Augustus, the man who once seemed a boy, now governs with the patience of someone who has learned that time is his greatest ally. He speaks little, but what he does speak is repeated endlessly by historians and scribes, etched into tablets, whispered in the corridors of power. He has created what everyone will call the Pax Romana, a peace that stretches from the Atlantic to the Euphrates and endures not by the absence of ambition, but by its careful redirection. You, drifting through this world, might notice the subtle changes. Roads are built and maintained, trade flows smoothly, taxes are collected efficiently in a manner that feels inevitable, like the tide. Soldiers patrol borders far from the city, leaving Rome itself free to hum with the quiet rhythm of domestic life. Citizens sleep easier. The people believe, at last, that order is natural, permanent. Yet the machinery of empire is relentless. Tiberius, Augustus's heir, is patient, calculating, and slightly melancholic. He observes rather than acts, letting the structures his predecessor created absorb the shocks of daily life. You can imagine him sitting in a villa on the Palatine Hill, watching the Tiber descend lazily to the sea, listening to the laughter of children in the Forum. To most, it seems like peace. To Tiberius, it is preparation, a quiet anticipation of the fragility beneath perfection. And life for ordinary Romans?
It is be steady.
The baker works at dawn, the blacksmith hammers at noon, the senator strolls at twilight, thinking profound thoughts and occasionally shouting at the sky for effect. You can almost hear the repetitive comfort of it all. The sound of water in aqueduct, the soft squeak of wagon wheels, the muted laughter of neighbors. Rome's laws become more codified. Augustus insists that morality be public in the same way a librarian insists that books be returned on time. You might find it amusing, the way private vices are turned into public lessons. Adultery, gambling, and excess are frowned upon, at least when they are visible. Behind closed doors, humans continue to be human, but the empire prefers not to see it. And yet, for all the order, the empire is never truly quiet. Rumors, whispers, gossip, they float like shadows along the Tiber. Senators grumble, soldiers complain about pay, philosophers mutter about virtue. The streets are calm, but the hum of underlying tension never disappears entirely. Trade thrives. Grain flows from Egypt, wine from Gaul, olive oil from Hispania. Rome, once a city fighting for survival, now controls the world as if it were a particularly stubborn library book.
Everything is catalogued, measured, and, most importantly,
Predictable. Temples are repaired, statues are erected, and monuments quietly remind citizens that their peace exists because someone powerful decided it should. You might notice that Augustus rarely takes the spotlight in person. He allows others to parade his achievements, to whisper his name in the Forum. There is subtle genius in this. The empire feels larger than the man who governs it. People sleep better believing that Rome itself is eternal, rather than any single ruler. And while the city slumbers in this carefully maintained order, the rest of the empire hums with quiet productivity. Farmers in Hispania tend olive groves. Ships sail across the Mediterranean carrying papyrus, spices, and gossip. Soldiers drill along the Rhine, quietly perfecting formations in case a restless tribe decides to awaken. You can almost hear the lapping of water along Alexandria's harbour, the distant clang of smiths in Britannia, the soft scrape of carts in Judea. Everywhere the empire moves in measured steps, like a cat walking across sun-warmed marble. The people love the peace because it is gentle, predictable, almost hypnotic. There is no need to be heroic tonight, no need to seize power, no need to sleep with one eye open. Life is comfortable enough that most forget how fragile it really is. Even the emperors who follow Augustus, Tiberius, then Caligula, understand the necessity of rhythm. Tiberius rules with quiet discipline, often from villas on Capri, leaving the Senate to mimic the motion of power. Caligula, when he appears, seems to forget the lesson entirely, but the machinery Augustus built absorbs the shocks with remarkable resilience. And so, the empire endures. You can picture it at night. Lamps flicker along the Forum. Water glistens in fountains. Dogs curl under the steps of houses. And the Tiber flows silently past bridges that have held the city together longer than any man could. It is the kind of peace that lulls you, or at least it lulls those who are not watching the horizon. You, drifting here, might notice the irony: peace maintained by structures designed for war. Civilization's gentle hum built upon centuries of chaos. Yet somehow it works. Somehow the city sleeps. Even the emperor, in his private chambers, feels the weight of it. Augustus lies in bed at night, listening to the distant echoes of the city he governs. He counts the hours, checks his reports in his mind, and knows that he is lucky. The empire is young, vast, and obedient, and yet history whispers that it will test him, eventually, in ways he cannot imagine. For now, though, the empire rests. The streets of Rome are quiet. The markets have closed. The people, even those unaware of the intricacies of governance, are lulled into rhythm. And as you, the listener, follow this slow march of time, you notice that the Pax Romana is less a proclamation and more a sensation, a soft, enduring, almost sleepy certainty that the world can be measured, organized, and most importantly, managed. Sleep into it. Let the roads, the aqueducts, the distant rhythm of empire carry you softly. The machinery is running. The peace is maintained. The people, the senators, the soldiers, all are drifting in the current of order Augustus created. And somewhere, in the quiet, history waits for the next whisper, the next scandal, the next empire to remind everyone that even sleep is fragile.
Rome sleeps, or at least it appears to. The streets are quiet.
The aqueducts hum softly, carrying water like a lullaby. Markets are closed, shops shuttered. Yet beneath the polished marble and orderly citizenry, the subtle heartbeat of tension persists. Faint, almost imperceptible, but real. After Augustus dies, Tiberius takes the throne. You can picture him, pale, meticulous, observing from villas on Capri while others act in the city below. He rules quietly, leaving the Senate to perform gestures of authority that now have little meaning. The people go about their days, bread, baths, prayer, unaware that the real power is concentrated behind walls, in decisions made far from their streets. Peace, in this form, is a gentle deception. And then comes Caligula, whose name alone makes you yawn nervously at the absurdity of history. He begins with promise, a child of empire raised on its rhythms, but quickly drifts into excess. Imagine him strolling the forum, declaring himself a god, demanding honors, and occasionally insulting senators for amusement. The city whispers, the Senate groans, and soldiers indulge him, partly from loyalty, partly from fear. Yet the machinery Augustus left intact absorbs it all. The empire does not collapse. Rome does not burn. It hums on like a clock that has learned to tolerate the occasional slip in its gears. Next comes Claudius, calm and scholarly, though perceived as weak by many. He surprises everyone by governing efficiently, expanding the empire, and keeping the peace. You might picture him with scrolls in hand, issuing edicts while the streets below carry on their habitual rhythm. Rome learns that power, once structured well, can survive eccentricity. Stability is less about personalities than it is about institutions, about bricks, roads, laws, and habits. And then there is Nero, perhaps the most famous example of the fragile lull beneath peace. He indulges in art, theatre, and personal spectacle, often at the expense of reason. You can imagine him on stage, singing, acting, performing, while the city hums and occasionally panics at fires or conspiracies. Yet, astonishingly, the empire does not unravel. The Pax Romana endures not because people are wise, but because Augustus's foundations were sound, deep enough to carry the weight of folly. The ordinary Romans continue their lives unaware of emperors' eccentricities, yet benefiting from the stability those rulers provide. Farmers in Hispania plant crops, legionaries drill on distant borders, traders sail across the Mediterranean. The hum of civilization continues, measured, predictable, hypnotic, even in the face of occasional disaster, fire, famine, or corruption. The structures Augustus left maintain continuity. You can almost hear the quiet rhythm of the city. The Tiber flowing, water in aqueducts, lamps flickering across marble, the murmur of citizens' voices in alleyways. It is the sound of a civilization comfortably asleep, or at least convinced it can be. You, drifting along in this narrative, might notice a certain irony. The longest peace in Rome's history is not the result of perfect rulers, but of clever management and human inertia. People accept the status quo. Soldiers follow orders, citizens obey laws, and so the empire drifts, vast and drowsy, like a cat curling along sun-warmed marble. Even the empire's excesses, Caligula's cruelty, Nero's performances are absorbed, almost cushioned, by the structures Augustus designed. Rome has learned, softly, that order is stronger than the whims of men, and history hums gently in the background, noting the peculiar effectiveness of quiet control over dramatic heroics. The Pax Romana lasts, and in its calm, the empire flourishes. Roads connect distant provinces. Cities expand. Trade thrives. Art, architecture, and culture flourish quietly, punctuated by occasional triumphs that thrill the populace without shaking the foundations. Imagine the daily life of a Roman citizen in this period. The baker rises before dawn. The market fills with the scent of bread and olives. Children play in courtyards. Scholars study scrolls in shaded libraries. Soldiers march along distant roads, never too far from the cities they protect. All is orderly. All is predictable. All is comfortably dull in the most reassuring way possible, even as history surges elsewhere, but revolts, foreign wars, political intrigue. Rome itself seems insulated, wrapped in the quiet efficacy of Augustus's designs. You can feel it in the rhythm of empire. Soft, persistent, and lulling. A civilization that has learned the art of endurance. And as you, the listener, drift with it, the lesson becomes clear. Peace is not the absence of chaos, but its careful management. Stability is not the absence of ambition, but the channeling of it. Civilization, when well built, can hum along for centuries, quietly absorbing the sparks that might otherwise set it aflame. The Pax Romana is both comforting and slightly absurd. A massive empire maintained by habits, structures, and gentle coercion. It is sleepy, but alive. It is predictable, but fragile. It is, in a way, the perfect backdrop for someone listening late at night, learning history, and feeling themselves drift slowly into the long, steady rhythm of time. Rome sleeps, and so do you. The empire endures. The streets are calm. The Tiber flows, and history hums its lullaby just beneath the surface. Rome had slept for nearly 200 years. Under Augustus, Tiberius, and their successors, the empire had settled into a rhythm, a steady, hypnotic cadence of law, taxes, roads, and games. Citizens went about their lives, soldiers drilled obediently, and the Tiber flowed with gentle, patient consistency. But like all slumber, even the longest, calmest, and most secure sleep can be interrupted. By the 3rd century, the empire began to stir uneasily. It was subtle at first. A rebellion here, a legion declaring a commander emperor there, barely enough to ruffle the edges of daily life. Yet the frequency increased. The slumber became light, restless, punctuated by whispers of instability. The empire had grown too vast, its borders too long, and the machinery that Augustus had built so meticulously began to show small cracks, then cracks that widened like slow-growing shadows. You might picture the northern frontier along the Rhine and Danube. Cold rivers, dense forests and tribes, always tribes, who had never known Rome except as a distant rumour. The legions posted there were disciplined, loyal, and increasingly frustrated. They were far from home, marching over wet earth and ice, watching the forests, wondering when the next attack would come from Gothic raiders, Alemanni warriors, or the restless chaos that always gathers at the edge of an empire. Meanwhile, the east simmered with threats as well. Persians pressed on the borders, fortified cities demanded attention, and governors who were supposed to maintain peace sometimes declared themselves emperors, convinced the empire needed new leadership, or perhaps that they deserved it. And so Rome entered the crisis of the 3rd century. A century-long period of slow-motion chaos, a drowsy storm that disrupted the rhythm of peace without ever quite annihilating it. Emperors came and went like leaves in a restless wind. Some lasted mere months,
Others a few years at most. You could almost hear the sighs of the citizens.
the distant whispers of not another one, as yet another general claimed the purple cloak of Rome. This period was marked by the curious combination of energy and lethargy. Armies marched vigorously, campaigns erupted across Europe, Asia, and Africa, yet the underlying society moved with the same steady rhythms. Markets still opened, grain still flowed, families still celebrated marriages and births, and roads remained remarkably intact. Chaos did not destroy Rome entirely. It merely stretched the empire thin like a soft bedspread pulled in too many directions. The economy, predictably, began to strain. Inflation crept in quietly, at first almost imperceptibly. Coins were debased, prices rose, merchants grumbled, bakers rolled their eyes. Citizens adjusted their expectations. All the while, emperors issued edicts promising reform, stability, and victory. Slogans repeated like a mantra, as if saying it loudly enough could summon security back from the edge of disorder. Meanwhile, external pressures intensified. Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine. Persians pressed in from the east. Pirates, bandits, and discontented governors harassed the provinces. You can picture the legionaries, weary from constant travel, trudging through mud and rain, setting up camps that would be abandoned as quickly as they were built, sent to quell rebellions that might flare again tomorrow. Everyday life continued, but it carried the faint scent of danger. A subtle tension hummed through Rome like a barely audible drumbeat. Within the city itself, the Senate and people clung to illusion. The purple cloak of power changed hands so frequently that loyalty became a ritual rather than a conviction. Civic ceremonies persisted, festivals were held, bread and games continued, as though repeating the rhythms of peace might convince the restless empire that it could endure. And in a sense it did. The machinery Augustus built remained resilient, absorbing shocks, redistributing resources, and maintaining communication across vast distances. Some emperors were competent, others bizarre, and a few downright terrifying. Maximinus Thrax, a giant of a man and a soldier by instinct, ruled through sheer force. Gordian, Pupienus, Balbinus, names that roll off the tongue like soft sighs, each rising to power only to vanish into the shadows of history. Yet the empire endured, like a long, groaning vessel steering through fog, each captain steering briefly before disappearing into mist. Amid this unrest, the provinces developed their own rhythms. Gaul, Hispania, and Britannia began to rely more heavily on local authority. Trade continued along the Mediterranean, through the Levant, across the Nile and into distant Africa. Communication slowed, yes, but Rome's vast web of roads, aqueducts, and officials allowed life to continue in a muted, hypnotic fashion. And somewhere, in the quiet corridors of imperial villas, the lessons of Augustus were both honoured and ignored. Discipline, order, and subtle propaganda persisted. Yet ambition could not be fully restrained. Generals wanted command, soldiers wanted rewards, governors wanted autonomy. It was a delicate balancing act in a slow-moving dance of threat and reassurance. Through all of this, you can picture ordinary Romans, citizens, farmers, traders, and children, moving through their days, largely unaware of the delicate chaos swirling around them. Life carried on in its ordinary, predictable rhythm, and that rhythm, the daily routines, the quiet work, the small comforts, is what ultimately preserved Rome. History moves through disasters, wars and emperors, but civilization endures because the simple, habitual acts of countless people continue quietly, even as everything else falters. By the end of the 3rd century, the empire has survived nearly every conceivable strain. Borders are challenged.
Armies are restless.
The succession of emperors seems endless. Yet, the Pax Romana, long fragile, persists in fragments, held together by infrastructure, administration, and the ingrained habits of citizens. You can almost sense it, as if the empire itself is breathing slowly, trying to remain calm despite the storm. This period, though chaotic on the surface, offers a kind of sleepy rhythm for a listener like you. History, in all its grand drama, is filtered down to the quiet persistence of society, people continuing their lives, empires adapting, orders repeated, mistakes absorbed. Even as generals rise and fall,
Rome endures like a candle flickering in a drought.
stubborn, patient, and luminous in the darkness. And so, as you drift along the long corridors of time, imagine the empire stretching from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Persia. Soldiers march,
Merchants trade.
families tend homes, emperors rule briefly, fade quickly, and are replaced, yet the city and the people carry on. It is a lullaby of resilience,
A lesson in endurance.
a hum of civilization. You may find it strangely comforting. The empire is never perfect,
Never fully secure, never entirely peaceful. And yet it continues.
century after century, carrying the echoes of Augustus, the weight of law, and the soft murmur of human habit. The crisis of the 3rd century ends not with fanfare, but with exhaustion. Rome, battered yet unbroken, begins to stabilize under emperors who learn the delicate art of ruling without disruption. And you, the listener, have drifted through the storm, absorbing history gently, feeling the pulse of an empire that, against all odds, survives because it moves slowly, patiently and consistently, even when chaos threatens. Sleep into that thought. The empire endures, the city hums, the Tiber flows. And you, like Rome itself, drift gently through the long, endless night of time. Rome had survived centuries of unrest, rebellion, and ambitious generals, only to arrive at a curious paradox. The city had grown too vast, too intricate, too demanding for one emperor to govern effectively. The machinery Augustus built still worked, but it groaned under its own weight, stretching across deserts, rivers, mountains, and seas. And so, in the late 3rd century, a new solution emerged, one of structure, hierarchy, and careful control, known to historians as the dominate. The man at the center of this transformation was Diocletian, who became emperor in 284 CE. You can imagine him, tall and deliberate, surveying the empire as if it were a chessboard, every province a piece, every general a pawn. He was not subtle in appearance or in action. He wore the purple and gold of power ostentatiously, insisted on rituals that reinforced awe, and made it clear that he ruled as a god among men, or at least as a man whose will should be unquestioned. The first order of business was to divide responsibility. The empire, after all, was immense. Borders stretched from Britain to the Persian frontier, and trying to manage everything from Rome was like trying to hold the ocean in your hands. Diocletian created the Tetrarchy, ruled by four: two senior emperors, titled Augusti, and two junior emperors, titled Caesars, each with delegated authority over parts of the empire. The arrangement was meant to stabilize succession, prevent rebellion, and make administration more manageable. You can picture it in practice. In the east, a Caesar overseeing Egypt, Syria, and Anatolia, watching over wealthy provinces and defending the borders from Persian incursions. In the west, a Caesar marching along the Rhine and Danube, inspecting legions, keeping restless tribes in check. Meanwhile, the Augusti coordinate from Nicomedia and Milan, issuing edicts and collecting taxes. The bureaucracy hums, a well-oiled machine humming through every province. For the citizens, the Tetrarchy is subtle. Life continues as it always has. Markets open, bread is baked, roads remain crowded with carts and travellers. Yet above them, the machinery of empire now moves with increased precision and ceremony. Diocletian imposes stricter hierarchies, elaborate court rituals, and an elaborate system of officials. He controls not just soldiers and senators, but appearances, titles, and the perception of power itself. Taxes are reformed, though less gently than Augustus might have preferred. Diocletian introduces new forms of accounting and new expectations. Provinces grumble, farmers sigh, merchants complain quietly, yet the empire endures. After all, the Tetrarchy is designed to prevent one man's whims from toppling the system entirely. It is, in its own way, sleepy, precise, almost mechanical. A lullaby of order in an enormous, fractious world. And yet, as always, human ambition creeps into the machinery. The Tetrarchy is clever but not infallible. Relationships between rulers shift. Generals feel empowered. Borders are restless. Wars continue, though smaller, more contained than in the chaos of the 3rd century. It is the hum of civilization, persistent, enduring, but never perfectly calm. Then comes Constantine, the man who will change the empire forever. You can picture him riding into history like someone very aware of the story he is meant to tell. He consolidates power, first in the West, then over the entire empire. His victory at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE feels, in retrospect, almost inevitable, though it was anything but in the moment. He sees a vision, or claims to, promising divine favor if he prevails. The soldiers march, the banners wave, and Rome tilts once again, quietly, toward the extraordinary. Constantine introduces new concepts, new cities, and new centers of power. He establishes Constantinople, strategically positioned, richly built, and symbolically designed to be a capital that rivals Rome itself. You can imagine it: aqueducts, forums, temples, bustling markets, and the faint scent of the sea. A city designed not only to govern, but to impress, to last, and to hum with life while the rest of the empire continues its ordinary rhythm. For ordinary Romans, life is largely unchanged. Their bread, baths, work, and festivals persist. Yet in the shadows, power is increasingly centralized. The emperor becomes a distant, almost divine figure, and the Senate gradually fades into ceremonial irrelevance. The illusions of the Republic linger, but their substance has gone. Power is concentrated, precise, and absolute. The dominate is not subtle, but it is enduring. Even as the East flourishes, the West begins to fray. The pressures of defending vast borders, managing distant provinces, and overseeing an intricate bureaucracy stretch the empire thin. Germanic tribes press closer to the Rhine. Huns gather in the east. Visigoths and Vandals begin to appear on the horizon of history like restless shadows. You can picture the frontier legions, weary and alert, patrolling cold rivers and forests, watching, waiting, prepared for disturbances that will inevitably come. The empire survives through administration, ritual, and sheer inertia. Roads, aqueducts, and fortifications ensure communication, trade, and movement. Provinces pay tribute, soldiers march and drill. Citizens maintain daily life, and the emperors, careful and deliberate, manage crises through hierarchy, law, and spectacle. Yet there is an underlying melancholy in this period. The empire is vast, resilient, and capable, but it is beginning to divide in ways that will eventually matter. East and West drift apart, culturally, politically, and militarily. The machinery hums, but it hums in two separate tunes, barely synchronized. The dream of a single eternal Rome becomes more fragile, more a matter of perception than reality. You, listening softly, can sense the rhythm of it all. Slow marches, administrative edicts, ceremonies and rituals, the quiet hum of commerce, the constant movement of people and goods. Civilization endures despite human folly, ambition, and error. And in this endurance, there is a kind of drowsy comfort. A reminder that even empires, sprawling and chaotic, can maintain a rhythm, a lullaby of civilization that continues across centuries. The Dominate sets the stage for the next great transformations. Christianity becomes increasingly central. The West and East will follow divergent paths, and the empire will confront challenges that will test every lesson Augustus taught. Yet for now, the machinery works. Life continues. Rome endures, wide, complex, and quietly humming like a vast, ancient heartbeat, and you, drifting along, feel it too, the slow, persistent pulse of history, the enduring rhythm of human civilization, and the faint, reassuring echo of Rome, vast, resilient, imperfect, but remarkably, persistently alive.
Rome had endured
Centuries of ambition, civil war, intrigue, rebellion, and reform had brought the empire to staggering heights. Augustus had built it, the Pax Romana had lulled it into a long, slow rhythm, and the Dominate had extended its endurance. Yet empires, no matter how vast or meticulous, are always fragile when stretched beyond the limits of their own endurance. By the 4th century, the West and East had already drifted apart in ways subtle and profound. While Constantinople gleamed across the Bosporus, Rome remained, for all its glory, increasingly reliant on illusion and memory. The western provinces, stretched thin and exposed, began to fray quietly. You can imagine the citizens in Gaul, Hispania, and Britain going about their daily lives, little realizing that the machinery that had ensured stability was straining beneath invisible weight. The empire's borders, once managed with careful, hypnotic precision, were now vulnerable. Germanic tribes, the Visigoths, Vandals, Ostrogoths, pressed at the Rhine and Danube, pushing slowly, persistently, as though aware that the empire's sleep was light. Huns moved from the east like shadows over forests and mountains, their movements deliberate, patient, and unstoppable. The empire's frontier soldiers, loyal and disciplined, were exhausted. They marched across cold rivers, snow-dusted plains, and thick forests, aware that every battle was another stitch in the slowly unraveling tapestry of empire. Meanwhile, internal instability crept along, less visible but equally destructive. Emperors continued to rise and fall, some murdered, others deposed, yet the administration itself began to fragment. Governors in distant provinces acted with increasing autonomy, sometimes ignoring imperial decrees entirely. Taxes became more onerous, inflation more persistent, and loyalty more transactional. Citizens grumbled quietly, farmers adjusted their expectations, and merchants accepted delays and shortages as part of life. Life itself continued, but the pulse of civilization began to falter. You can picture the city of Rome during these decades. Markets still bustling, aqueducts carrying water with familiar rhythm, temples standing proud and echoing with ritual prayers. Yet beneath the surface the ground quivered. The Senate was a shadow of itself, more ceremonial than functional. Aristocrats clung to wealth, while common citizens struggled with the increasingly strained economy. Bread and games persisted, though less lavishly, and the hum of civilization continued, a faint, comforting background to the slow erosion of real authority. In 376 CE, disaster arrived quietly but decisively. The Visigoths, fleeing the Huns, sought refuge within Roman territory. At first, it seemed a manageable problem. The empire, after all, had faced invasions before, but bureaucracy and corruption slowed the response. Supplies were insufficient, agreements were ignored, and tensions built steadily, like water rising behind a dam. The following year, at the Battle of Adrianople, the Visigoths defeated the Roman army and killed Emperor Valens. The loss was catastrophic, not because of the immediate military defeat, but because it signaled something far more profound. The empire's defenses, once precise and unyielding, could no longer absorb the shocks of external pressure. The illusion of invincibility, so carefully maintained for centuries, began to dissolve. You can imagine the aftermath: cities whispering rumors, citizens worrying quietly about security, provincial leaders scrambling to maintain authority. Yet life continued stubbornly in markets and fields, in homes and temples. The empire's pulse remained, slow, measured, faintly reassuring, even as the cracks widened beneath the surface. By the 5th century, the Western Empire was a shell of its former self. Military, economic, and political pressures compounded relentlessly. Emperors were children or puppets, elevated by generals whose loyalties were uncertain. Rebellions erupted in Gaul, Africa, and Hispania. Vandals, pushed by necessity and opportunity, moved into North Africa, cutting off the empire from vital grain supplies. The Visigoths moved south through Italy, eventually sacking Rome in 410 CE, a city that had not fallen to an enemy in over 8 centuries. Picture the streets during that sack. The Tiber still flowing lazily, the Forum half empty, citizens and soldiers both exhausted, temples standing but echoing hollowly. Looting occurred, but with a strange rhythm, not chaotic, but persistent, methodical. And through it all, the hum of Rome's civilization continued in surviving areas, markets in the suburbs, granaries still supplying local populations, and the machinery of bureaucracy quietly absorbing what remained. The empire, however, could not recover its unity. The West had become overextended, its economy strained, and its borders porous. Military power had shifted, increasingly dependent on mercenary forces who answered only to paychecks, not loyalty. The once invincible legions had dwindled in strength, and their discipline could not withstand the relentless pressure of migrations and invasions. By 476 CE, the end arrived not with a great battle or climactic fire, but quietly, almost politely. Romulus Augustus, the last emperor of the Western Empire, was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer.
No armies marched in unison to celebrate.
No senators shouted in despair. It was, in essence, a transfer of authority wrapped in ceremony and resignation. The West had fallen, but life in Rome continued at markets, baths, and festivals persisted in diminished form, as if civilization itself refused to acknowledge defeat. Meanwhile, the East, centered in Constantinople, endured. It carried forward the traditions of Rome, bureaucratic structures intact, culture vibrant, trade thriving. The Byzantine Empire, as it would later be called, became the custodian of Roman civilization, ensuring that the legacy of Augustus, the dominate, and centuries of governance persisted in some form. And so, as the Western Empire faded, the lessons of history become clear. Or perhaps, quietly whispered, empires fall not always in a blaze, but often in the slow accumulation of stress, error, and human limitation. Civilization endures, however, through habit, structure, and persistence. Roads, aqueducts, institutions, laws, and people themselves carry the memory of Rome long after its political structures vanish. You, listening late at night, can feel the hum of this long decline. You can imagine the streets once full of soldiers and senators now quieter, the markets continuing, children playing, bread still baking in ovens. The machinery of empire, though diminished, persists in fragments, carrying forward the habits and rhythms that allowed Rome to exist for a millennium. And perhaps that is the most remarkable thing. Rome fell, the Western Empire ended, and yet life continued. Civilization adapted, human rhythms persisted, history whispered its story in soft, steady tones rather than explosive clamor. And through it all, you, the sleepy listener, drift with the empire, witnessing centuries of rise, triumph, peace, chaos, and collapse, yet lulled by the persistent heartbeat of humanity, Rome. The city, the empire, the civilization, as ye may have fallen politically, but it remains alive in the memory, the infrastructure, the culture, and the quiet, enduring pulse of history itself. And you, drifting now through the corridors of time, are carried gently along by that pulse, tired, fascinated, and soothed by the endless rhythm of human endeavor. Good night, traveler.
Rome has whispered its story.
You may sleep now.